From AmeriVet Securities, a service-disabled, veteran-owned broker-dealer in New York City, we bring you Compass Check, a podcast created by veterans for veterans. The military uses a compass to navigate air, land, and sea. Now, Compass Check is here to help you navigate your transition into the corporate workforce. Our goal is to reach military veterans and members of the veteran community, empower and connect them with a multitude of resources that will ultimately set them up for success after leaving the military. I'm your host, Army veteran James Fitzgerald. Let's get moving. Minority Veterans of America is a 501c3 nonprofit that is dedicated to changing the narrative of the American veteran and building community around underrepresented identities. MVA is a non-partisan organization working to create an equitable and just world for the minority veteran community. MVA's work focuses on four major areas: LGBTQ, women, veterans of color, and religious minorities. Membership to MVA is completely free, and you do not need to be a veteran to join. Through the building of community alliances and partnerships, MVA continues to grow and gains in strength as they all work towards a common goal. My guest today is Lindsay Church, a Navy veteran, executive director, and co-founder of Minority Veterans of America. Lindsay has nearly a decade of experience rooted in veteran advocacy and grassroots organizing. Lindsay has also contributed both interviews and op-eds in national publications such as The Washington Post, NPR, Military Times, and Task and Purpose. Today's episode will include my conversation with Lindsay, plus some additional footage highlighting the important work of Minority Veterans of America. Here's our conversation. Welcome aboard. I'm excited to have you here with me today, Lindsay, to talk about Minority Veterans of America, but also to continue our discussion about some of the necessary resources and things that are needed for the veteran community as they're transitioning out of active duty service and into the corporate workforce. So thank you for joining us on this leg of our journey.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
No problem. We'll go ahead and jump right into it. Can you give us a brief background into Minority Veterans of America, when you were founded, what your core values are, and like what the mission statement is, and then we'll take it from there.
Absolutely. So Minority Vets is a young organization. We were started in 2017. We started about a little less than 2 weeks after the trans ban was announced via tweet. So we started in what we call the greatest hits era, where women's rights were being scaled back. Muslims were being banned from being able to come to the country. Then we saw the trans ban. And at some point, my co-founder is a Korean American woman veteran named Catherine Pratt, incredible advocate, who we came together and said, I think that the two of us, we don't understand how each other is experiencing the world, but we do understand what marginalization means, and we understand what it means in the community, that there isn't enough space for minority veterans to gather. And so a few weeks after that, we decided we were going to start an organization that was going to be an intersectional movement of minority veterans. And so our whole premise is that when one of us is harmed, we are all harmed, and it's all of our responsibility to gather as a community, to bring together a healthy culture, but also to fight the system to ensure that future generations of service members don't experience the same things that we do, and that veterans have an opportunity to come home and live exactly as we designed it, and being able to access their benefits, being able to access their education, being able to access the same opportunities as their dominant culture counterparts.
MVA is important to me because I've served my country for over 18 years. And this is a country where race, sexuality, gender identity, or expression shouldn't matter. MVA fights for those things.
I'm an MVA leader because I believe that systemic change is within reach. and that the most dangerous thing that we can be is organized. With MVA, I found my sense of belonging and my sense of purpose in moving our community towards a collective voice to create collective action to eliminate systemic inequities. I truly believe we can be the generation to usher in a better veteran community for us all.
I want to leave behind a world that's a better place to be human, cleaner, more equitable, more just, more inclusive. And I could do some of that on my own, but I can do so much more as a part of a powerful organization like Minority Veterans of America.
Why am I a Minority Veterans of America leader? The reason I am is because this is an organization that is working to get veterans of all types, to get them engaged, empowered, and put in a position where they can make positive changes in their own community.
A collective voice that is bigger, stronger, and more capable of fighting for change by representing the needs, experiences, and spectrum of identities of the minority veteran community.
Tell your story. Create change.
Create change.
Create change.
Create change.
Your community is waiting.
Your community is waiting.
Your community is waiting.
I want to underscore everything that you had just mentioned about why the organization was formed with the impacted community, whether it be one issue or another, should not be the only community in the fight for change, for equality, for a better tomorrow. It's not a one front battle. It should be all of us lined up. So it's a full court press to ensure that if something is inflicting or impacting one of us, to your point, it's something that's hurting all of us, and we will do our best to ensure that we're all taken care of.
Absolutely, and I think that the thing that we organized around most was that we knew as individual communities we were small. LGBTQ community is a little over 1 million. Women veterans are 2 million. Altogether, racial ethnic minorities make up 5.5 million. But when you break that out into different groups and different racial identities, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. When you are 1 million or 2 million or even 3 million of 20 million, the ability for you to make change is limited because you don't have power, you don't have collective action, you don't have the ability that your community has mobilized around these values and these policy priorities. And so our voices at every intersection were continuing to be marginalized and pushed to the fray as if they didn't matter.
We just spent 2.5 years going through the COVID-19 pandemic. It impacted the entire globe immensely. The impact that it had on the veteran community was enormous, but inside of our veteran community, we have underserved and under-resourced communities that need attention and that needed support during the COVID-19 pandemic. So what I want to do is take a trip on our DeLorean and, hop back 2.5 years. I'd like to know what it is that was going on for you in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic. How did Minority Veterans of America shift gears in order to adapt and overcome during the pandemic to continue providing your services and advocacy, but also what additional programs had to be employed in order to meet veterans where they're at and provide the services that were required for them to, make it through along with their family?
It's a big question, and we'll get in our DeLorean. So 2020 came, so I actually, ironically, had just moved to Richmond, Virginia at the end of 2019. Had surgery at the very beginning of 2020, and then the world melted down. And it was terrifying. It was one of those moments where, like, how do I do this? How do we serve our community? At the same time, minority veterans were disproportionately impacted by the system and by COVID-19 because they existed at the margin. We already had all of these huge health disparities, economic disparities, all of these issues and these cracks in the system were exacerbated by COVID. So not only were we as an organization in that time, I think we had maybe 1,000 members and like one staff member, and we had to pivot our entire platform. I will say that COVID-19 was a proving ground for MVA. Like we had an opportunity to really show who we were and what we were capable of. Now, our community didn't just experience the pandemic. Our community also experienced all of the other things that were happening in 2020. So while we were trying to pivot our entire platform, we were also trying to organize because we don't have the opportunity to just sit back when it comes to the social issues, when it comes to, rights, when it comes to, George Floyd being murdered, Vanessa Guillen being murdered. Our communities were struggling with COVID and the rest of the world and what was happening. And so we had this enormous task of figuring out how do we recreate and recraft ourselves to be exactly what the community needs right now. And as a young organization, it was terrifying, but it's also a moment in time where we had the opportunity to reach more people than we've ever reached before. So we started with, virtual programming, getting people engaged, talking on coffee hours, literally so many people in our community struggle with mental health concerns that we were just looking for connection. People just wanted to talk to each other because you're sitting in this quiet by yourself. And a lot of our community we're students living by themselves and stuck in this space by themselves. So we started with virtual programming, and then we started to realize that we couldn't just do virtual programming. We actually had to figure out how are we going to resource the community as much as we possibly can. So we started a COVID-19 relief fund. It was literally direct payments to the community because many people were saying, you need to prove this, that, and the other thing, and then we'll maybe give you a bag of groceries. But for us, we knew our community needed agency. Not everybody was struggling with food insecurity. Some people couldn't keep their lights on. Some people were struggling with rent. Some people were struggling with food. But everybody needed their own services and needed to be able to have that agency and that dignity and being able to choose what they needed, because we, as a community, still treat people as if they're lying to us, as if they're not actually going to do what they say they're going to do with this money, and still put these, sanctions and being able to really use that money the way that you need it. So we actually ended up issuing about $66,000 or $70,000 in direct financial relief, which was, I think, our COVID reliefs were about half of our budget that year. And actually it might've been more than that of our budget that we literally didn't have, but we knew we had to. So community showed up to support it. We found grants to do it. We did everything that we could. Most of we had one staff member. It was not me. It was our Seattle program director. And it was literally our whole community. I've never seen so many volunteers show up at once, literally just wanted to get in there and find a way to serve. So we did the COVID-19 relief fund. We actually last year ended up doing a supply drop tour, because we started with supply drops at the end of 2020, where we literally just gave out 100 pounds of food to every family that showed up. Our supply drop tour, we gave out 23 tons of food in 6 cities in 6 months and served about 300 veterans and their families. And we met so many people along the way. MVA's membership grew. We doubled in 1 year. And we also organized. It wasn't just MVA working on COVID relief. You saw MVA organizers in the streets, organizing, showing up to rallies, showing up to protests, continuing to remind the community that we're not just people that need services. We are people that have a voice, and that we are going to organize, and that we are going to try to heal the wounds in our community. And that's where a lot of our focus actually ended up being as well.
I want to hit on 2 points before we move into more of the discussion on Don't Ask, Don't Tell. The shared spaces that are needed for every community of every stripe. I thank you for creating one for minority veterans. Outside of Minority Veterans of America, there were very few safe spaces that minority veterans had available to gather, to share thoughts, ideas, and do it in a comfortable environment in which it just wasn't available countrywide. So thank you for that. Congratulations on the extreme success that you had in providing these vital services, food to our veterans, but just the families. that's something that's lost in a lot of our discussions, are the families that are involved in many of the issues that we're talking about, but they're kind of on the back burner when it really comes down to legislation and making sure that all aspects of the conversation are covered. So later on, we're going to be talking more about some of those dependent issues. But lastly, the COVID-19 pandemic put everyone in a unique situation. So I bring on these veteran serving organizations to talk about how they're supporting transitioning veterans into the corporate workforce. Those transitioning veterans were stuck at home just like everyone else during the pandemic. So we need to understand who was providing those services, how they were doing that, but also where they can get connected. And this is the meat and potatoes of what we're doing here. So it's great to have you on to talk about Minority Veterans of America in the sense of some of the services that are being directly provided. Now, we're going to switch gears and hit some of the advocacy that's been going on for quite some time. And
my favorite topic.
we're still in our DeLorean. We're taking a time road trip together. We're going back to the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Let's have a summation of from you, giving us an idea of what the environment was like before, during, and after Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed, not only for the veteran community, but those that were actively serving. What did that mean when that repeal came down?
So we are going to go back in our DeLorean 30 years, actually. We're going to go back to 1991, 1993 timeframe. This is actually when Don't Ask, Don't Tell was introduced. Many people don't know that Don't Ask, Don't Tell was actually supposed to be in our favor. Before Don't Ask, Don't Tell, there was an outright ban on anybody serving that was LGBTQ. They would be dismissed for homosexual conduct. And in 1993, President Clinton signed into law the military's policy of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which is the colloquial name for the policy. But the policy essentially said that queer people could serve as long as they weren't out, as long as they didn't tell, and as long as they didn't engage in homosexual activity. Well, I served all but 3 months under Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and let me tell you, being a young service member, it's impossible not to I don't know anybody that was queer that didn't at some point engage in homosexual conduct. But some of the things that people don't often talk about when it comes to Don't Ask, Don't Tell is that people were criminalized, their identities literally criminalized, sanctioned by law. And when we talk about Don't Ask, Don't Tell, many people were removed for telling, right? That were found out. No, there was supposed to be a Don't Ask, Don't Tell, Don't Pursue. So when you think about Don't Ask, Don't Tell, the people that got in trouble were the queer folks that were just living their own lives, were sexually assaulted, were, any number of things, but nobody ever got kicked out for pursuing or for asking. The only people that got kicked out were the queer folks that quote unquote tell or were found out. So the policy actually was very permissive of harassment, of discrimination, of sexual assault, of, because when we talk about sexual assault, it's not about sexual gratification, it's about power. And the military strives and lives on power and hierarchy. So for queer service members, the data is starting to come out, and the reports and the studies are starting to say queer folks are more likely to be sexually assaulted. Well, you created an environment that was permissive of homosexuality or homophobia, transphobia, all of it. And now we can't figure out why there was a sexual assault problem. So since then, we now fast forward to around 2011 when the policy is repealed. We have the biggest coming out party of our whole lives on September 20th. It's I like to call it the Department of Defense's coming out party. I've never been to a bigger one. I have personally was stationed in San Diego, California. I actually ran into Eric Alba just recently, who I spent that evening hanging out with on September 19th. He reminded me that we actually partied September 19th going into midnight to celebrate that September 20th is coming. And so it's this queer liberation moment of we are going to get free of this policy. And it was beautiful. I loved it. Everybody's coming out on social media and it's a big deal. And culture didn't change overnight. You don't get rid of homophobia. You don't get rid of transphobia as a result of a policy change. And all of a sudden, the Department of Defense becomes the most inclusive organization in the world. It's absolutely not what happened. Because later on, we saw that the trans ban was brought in. So that transphobia, the homophobia has not actually gone anywhere. It's just different. It's repackaged, it's repurposed. And oftentimes, like we think about Don't Ask, Don't Tell being repealed as like this beautiful, moment in time where we all really wanted to see queer people succeed. Well, let's talk about recruitment and retention, because people want to make sure that the military has enough people. We see it now that there's a recruitment problem. They can't recruit or retain enough people to be able to keep the military going. Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and that policy changing wasn't so much about our dignity and our agency and our well-being. It's about how the military is going to keep it going. A little bit cynical, but it's the reality of what happened. And like our community serves at a disproportionate rate. Trans people serve. 1 in 5 trans people will serve in their life. They know that they need us. And so the policies have changed. I don't think that it has changed enough inside the culture to really be this like accepting, organization that we talk about.
I also served during Don't Ask, Don't Tell. The vast majority of my service took place under this policy, and I frequently mentioned to other people, I could have easily been on the other side of this very policy as a gay man that was in the closet as much as any adult can be trying to live their lives outside of their workplace. So just looking at the information that's available of the impacts not only of this specific policy, but of the variety of policies that have been implemented and then weaponized against service members, causing them to lose out on benefits, causing them to lose out on resources. So a lot of the conversation that we're going to be having right now is going to be about those resource gaps for those individuals that require additional support or due to experiences in the military, whether it be military sexual assault, in any of the other things that we're going to discuss. It's an underserved community that continues to be victimized when they're not provided the resourcing required in order to heal and grow. So I want to switch gears. We've touched on the trans ban, but I want to hit on a connecting issue, which is military sexual trauma, MST, for short, in order for us to get a holistic view of some of the just trauma that is carried outside of the military after the service concludes.
Yeah, military sexual trauma, I think, is an issue that's starting to be talked about a bit more, but it's not talked about nearly enough. There have been mass moves to try to remove the commander's authority from reporting and trying cases of sexual assault and sexual harassment. There have even been moves to add sexual harassment to the UCMJ because UCMJ has never included sexual harassment. And we wonder why we have a sexual harassment and sexual assault problem. So military service, for those who are not necessarily as familiar, military sexual trauma has a very high prevalency, especially among women. I think you're more likely to be assaulted in the military than you are in college, which is terrifying. It should be scary for all of us. And even in the VA, 1 in 4 women will actually be sexually harassed or assaulted in a VA facility. So this continuum of harm continues from DOD all the way through into VA for the same people, because when you're not holding people accountable, the accountability rate for VAs or DOD is atrocious. When you're not holding people accountable, that's actually transferring over. Those same people become your patrons of VA. So this sexual assault, sexual harassment problem is actually a problem within DOD and VA. Now, when you talk about transition, getting benefits and access to benefits when you've been sexually harassed or sexually assaulted in the Department of Defense is really complicated, and oftentimes you don't have the requisite support in the service. This can lead to people just leaving the service altogether, hopefully at least through honorable conduct. But I use that quote loosely because many people self-medicate, many people end up in trouble, are actually criminalized by their own command, kicked out early, became pregnant, then had to leave the service. There's stories across the board of how people are not given appropriate support. Well, that transfers over into the Department of Veterans Affairs. Your claim for military sexual trauma is often just as traumatizing as the actual incident because you have to tell it to VA 3-4 times to new providers so that they can tell you whether or not they believe you. literally like the VA claims process for military sexual trauma is all about feeling whether or not they believe you that this happened. And so there's a lot of push to try to make this different or like make this process a little bit better, but it's really traumatizing. You'll hear from service members and veterans that try to get access to their VA benefits or their VA disability that are absolutely traumatized by the experiences that they have with VA claims folks. In addition, you also see major issues around sexual trauma survivors who are experiencing homelessness, experiencing financial insecurity, not able to go to VA facilities or don't want to go to VA facilities, have lost their benefits because they self-medicated, and the whole world doesn't understand that when you've been raped or sexually assaulted, sometimes you turn to drinking, or sometimes you turn to marijuana, or sometimes you turn to literally anything that can help numb that pain. And so our ability to comprehend how sexual trauma survivors survive is it can severely impacting whether or not we can serve them within the Department of Veterans Affairs.
My hope is this podcast can not only inform transitioning servicemen and women that are leaving the service, but inform the wide breadth of our armed forces on what's available once they get out. But with an understanding that there's a variety of ways that we may be transitioning out of our military service and into that corporate workforce. Some of them may be an other than honorable or a bad paper discharge. Doesn't make you less worthy to understand the benefits that you have available to you and the veteran serving organizations that are available and wanting you to frequent their programming. So with that, I want to continue down this pathway that we're walking currently and talk about discharge upgrades as a whole. There's a number of different categories when it comes to discharges from military service. We can get into that during another podcast episode. But the part that I want to highlight is the benefits that come with those various categories. Some more than others. The very few number of states that have taken strides to right some of these wrongs by providing legislation to provide state benefits, such as New York State with their restoration of honor. I'm going to kick it back to you because you've already done congressional testimony. You've done state level testimony in a variety of localities. You've been that advocate out front when it comes to ensuring that we're doing right by everyone that's signed that line to serve, even though they may have been unjustly discharged from Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Some of these other policies left military service in order to escape military sexual trauma or other extenuating factors. So I'm going to kick it over to you to give that nationwide delivery of what's necessary to go back and correct some of these outstanding issues.
Discharge Upgrades, I'm one of those people that has different messages on this. So one, our communities are disproportionately impacted by discharge, bad conduct or bad paper discharges. So service members who are LGBTQ, we know about this, whether it be the trans ban, Don't Ask, Don't Tell, people were discharged in the tens of thousands. We also know that Black and brown folks were more likely to be criminalized and more likely because the military courts hold largely white people making decisions about whether or not somebody is convicted, more likely to be convicted, more likely to end up in jail or prison after the fact of military service. If you look at I call it the military to prison pipeline, because at that point, there's a disproportionate number of Black, Indigenous, and Latinx veterans, plus trans communities in jails and prisons compared to their dominant culture counterparts. So we know that we have a problem with military injustice because it's not military justice. This is military injustice at this point. If we can't recognize service members who self-medicate for as a result of post-traumatic stress, military service is one of the most stressful, most traumatic experiences that you will ever endure in your whole life. If we cannot discern that these folks are really just trying to survive the trauma that is military service, we are doing our whole service injustice. At the same time, we have to build trust. Disenfranchised folks exist, and disenfranchised folks don't want to come in. When an entire military, an entire Department of Defense has laws and legislation against your entire existence. Literally, I tell people I have two brains, like two parts of my brain, one side that's queer and one side that's a veteran. And it took me years and years and years to put them back together.
Mm.
Why do you want to come back? Why do you? So we see VA efforts really trying to reach some of these, the folks that were discharged, trying to figure out how to get people through the process of a discharge upgrade. Well, nobody wants to walk through the door. Why? Because why would you want to? You were made to feel like a criminal everywhere you went. When you go to a VA facility, you still feel like a criminal. Yes, there are benefits, and that's probably like the best part of this, but you have to build trust with communities. Also, the Department of Defense has to own some of this. The Department of Defense is not helping to reach LGBTQ service members, though they should have a list of the 14,000 people that were removed under that one policy. Why is DoD not helping us with outreach and reaching those folks that it has disenfranchised and building that trust back up and making sure that people get their discharges upgraded? It's not happening.
We genuinely need leaders that have a veteran cultural competency, taking the lead, speaking to those behind closed doors, out in public, wherever they need to have this message delivered so they can understand the wide variety of colors, shapes, sizes that service comes in, that service may manifest at the end and be a transition point into a new chapter, but leave some lingering issues that we have to deal with as a society, as a veteran community, as an LGBTQ community, but the government has its part to play as well. Mm-hmm. So 501c3 nonprofit organizations like Minority Veterans of America are absolutely necessary because there are many service gaps, resource gaps that occur throughout the United States, and organizations such as yours are there to support the community, even when they're not invited to some of the more mainstream avenues of approach to support. So I want to continue down this line of discussion when it comes to a veteran population that hasn't really been talked about as much. And this is going to move us into our double time segment of today's Compass Check podcast. I'm excited about this because I'm an atheist veteran myself. And when I've looked around for that type of representation inside of the veteran community, it's few and far between, whether it be an organization or prominent veterans out front saying, we, are part of this as well. And we need to have a say in, what's happening, what's being provided, how can we support each other, so on and so forth. So I'm going to have our double time dedicated to a couple of different aspects, agnostic and atheists, but also just the other non-religious veterans that are out there.
Mm-hmm. You're hitting on a point that I think is really salient to this whole conversation, is that our country has very little understanding of religious minorities in the veteran community. So much of service is centered around Christianity. Like, how many prayers did you say? How many prayers did you sit through? I mean, there's a whole book called No Atheists in Foxholes, and that is absolutely untrue because there are atheists in foxholes. There is actually an atheist veterans organization. I think it's Atheist Veterans of America. They have been doing some incredible advocacy. So they do advocacy. Some of it is on veteran communities, but a lot of it is on military communities, because when we only limit ourselves to thinking about veteran issues, we often forget that we have the opportunity to fight for a better experience for somebody else so that our community is better off later. So there are times when organizations need to reach back into the Department of Defense and make sure that they're more inclusive. And there are many times when we need to be looking at the Department of Veterans Affairs. So in addition, I also want to talk about a few other religious minority categories that we also don't think about either, because when you look at what needs to happen right now, people are not, I'll even say that at MVA, we need to get better, and we're still working on it, getting better at religious minorities, because not much data exists, not much information about disparities exists. We are still at the very, very, very beginning of that. But you also see a rise in anti-Semitism. Who's talking about that? Who's actually saying something about how Jewish veterans are terrified to leave their homes? like that the people are actually living in fear of being the victim of a hate crime. Same goes for Muslims. The same goes for Sikh individuals. It's like we aren't really thinking about how beyond Christianity in the veteran community, how identities actually inform. Like there's a thing like people think that veteran identities are the only thing that informs and the only thing that we need to be thinking about. And you hit something earlier about like veterans need to be using that cultural competency lens to be able to push issues. I think about issues like the Equality Act, right? The Equality Act is, expanding LGBTQ legislation across the country to make sure that you have workplace protections, you have protections in your home, you have adapt all of it. Not enough veterans are trying to push this Equality Act because we don't use our veteran lens to be able to say, actually, the Equality Act might have protected us against don't ask, don't tell. Like maybe we should be thinking about this. Maybe we should be doing something to push these issues because as a very, very visibly queer person, like anybody who's a visible minority, like oftentimes your veteran status is the last thing you're thinking about because this is what's visible to the world. And this is what's marginalized every day. This is what's legislated every day. This is what's criminalized every day. And so I think it's really important in the conversation around religion and what the experiences are of religious people and religious minorities specifically or non-religious minorities. We also need to be thinking about the other like ways in which our identities inform more than our veteran status.
There's so much that we've discussed today, but there's so much that we didn't even get to. For my audio audience, there's a stack of reports next to me that we were going to go through that we didn't even get a chance to crack open, but that just incentivizes me to bring you back so we can go into more of these issues, not just what you've already been doing right now, on the advocacy front, but also the research that's been compiled in order to paint a better picture into what's needed. I didn't even get a chance to get into the New York Minority Veterans Needs Assessment that was published back in February of 2020. It's just like
a very good report. You should absolutely link that in here because it's one of the most comprehensive studies that's been done, and they look at those 5 indicators of outcomes. And I think that that's absolutely imperative in how we need to start looking at how veterans are served. So if anybody hasn't read the New York State Needs Assessment for Minority Veterans, you absolutely should. And I would love to come back and talk about it.
So we'll have to set that up, and you'll have to meet us further down the road on our transition journey out of the military and into the corporate workforce. For right now, Lindsay Church, co-founder, executive director, Minority Veterans of America. This is where we're going to have to take a breath, stretch, and leave our audience until we are able to join next time. So it was a pleasure to have you with us. There's so much more for us to cover, but for now, I'm going to say thank you, and I'll see you all later.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Compass Check. I've been your host and guide, Army veteran James Fitzgerald. See you next time.